What do George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Saint Valentine have in common? The month of February. The first two were born in that month, while the other prematurely died. But the month of February celebrates all three, and now you have a fourth reason to celebrate. Hello again, SA here. And when I'm not embarrassing myself on the internet, I'm also a published author, and I got a deal for you. Enjoy President's Day and Valentine's Day with my book series Glitch. It will be on sale for 25% off for the entire month. That way, when you're taking a load off on President's Day or getting sweets from your sweets, you can indulge in a story of a kidnapped teen model and a reluctant jewel thief who are on the run from the law. The links are down below in the description. And I'm not just some one-hit wonder. I got other books coming down the pike. So as long as nothing terrible happens to me.
And now...
Hey, Rocky! Watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat.
Again?
Nothing up my sleeve. Presto!
Wrong hat.
I take a 7.5.
Now here's something we hope you'll really like.
You'll see those books too. Now let's get back to the video. Hello again. SA here. Who was Alexei Navalny? If you listen to the Western news media, he was an opposition figure in Russia. But other people, smart people, such as Brian Beletic of New Atlas, and Natalie and Clayton Morse over at the Redacted, they said, actually no. Navalny was basically a sock puppet for the United States. And you say, really? Yeah. Indeed, Brian Beletic, he found an old post from WikiLeaks, yeah, those guys, that pretty much spilled the beans about Navalny. How he was affiliated with an outfit called the National Endowment for Democracy. And you say, who the hell is that? It's basically what they call in the spy world a cutout for the CIA. And you say, really? Yeah, really. However, Navalny, he probably made too much noise for his own damn good. Because this is not a new thing for the CIA. Indeed, anyone who remembers Operation Ajax knows how these people roll. Because back in the middle 20th century, you had this guy called Mossadegh. He was a popularly elected leader of Iran. And he decided to kick the British out of, or I should say, British Petroleum out of Iran. Why? Well, because they control basically Iran's oil reserves. And you say, how'd that happen? How indeed? Well, anyway, after he did, that pretty much put Mossadegh's life on contract. Because he also had the damn Shah also removed. He wasn't very popular back then. And then the CIA, working along with the British MI6, stepped in. And they basically staged a coup using the Iranian military to remove Mossadegh. And then they reinstalled the Shah. And after that, the Shah was very grateful. So much grateful that he basically became a sock puppet for the United States. Until he was finally overthrown 25 years later and replaced by the Ayatollahs of rock and roll. And he's not the only example. Remember Saddam Hussein? How can you not? Because in the lead up to the Iraq War, there was another CIA cutout. His name was Ahmed Chalabi. And at the time, people, or ordinary people, didn't know who this guy was. But the newsman said, "Oh, this guy, he's the George Washington of Iraq." Yeah, right. He was also a cutout for the CIA. And when the American army kicked in the door of Baghdad, they initially tried to install him as leader. But the Iraqis, ordinary citizens, a little bit too savvy. So he almost got sidelined. Almost. But eventually, the American occupation forces found a job for Chalabi. Yeah, they stuck him in something called the Governing Council of Iraq. And he was there for a while, too. But eventually, a few smart people, people who have integrity, started, looking into this guy's background. And that's when they found out the guy was a real scumbag. Yeah. Oh, yeah, he went to a business school in England back in the 1960s, but then they found out that the guy was a crook. Yeah. He stole a whole bunch of money from a bank in Jordan. How much? Not certain, but they think there was somewhere between 100 and 350 million US dollars. And he and the money disappeared, and he eventually ended up in Europe hanging around. And then when in the lead up to the Iraq War, he somehow introduced himself to old George W. and all the neocons. And what's the cliche? They have to cut this guy's jib. And that's when they invaded Iraq. They tried to put this guy in charge, but still, it didn't work out. So there you go. And wait for it. You ready? When the Americans decided to invade Afghanistan, which was before Iraq, they also had an idea who was going to replace the Taliban. Yeah, Hamid Karzai. And you say, who's this guy? Well, he made a name for himself during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan back in the 80s. Yeah, he basically primarily was a fundraiser. And then later on, he was part of something called the International Conference on Afghanistan. Yeah, so there you go. And then eventually, the Americans put him in charge of Afghanistan. Why? I think he was probably one of the few Afghans who could speak English without a weird accent, I suppose. But eventually, old Karzai, like Chalabi, eventually he wore out his welcome, and well, let's just say he's no longer in charge of Afghanistan. So there you go. But as for old Navalny, let's just say he didn't get that far. Why? Maybe because modern Russia isn't Afghanistan or Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It's not to say that the Americans haven't done stuff like this, tried to do stuff like this before Navalny. I mean, remember Yeltsin? Yeah. Because Yeltsin, he became leader of Russia almost by accident. Because the Soviet collapse occurred, he somehow finagled his way to become the de facto leader of the Russian Federation, and thus when the old communist empire fell apart like a $2 suitcase in the rain, he basically was the last man standing in charge of post-Soviet Russia. But then they had an election, I think it was in 1996, and everyone thought he was going to lose. But then the Americans stepped in quietly and basically, used propaganda to pump up Yeltsin's profile and say, hey, Yeltsin, he ain't all that bad. Not compared to the people who were running against him, which was the Communist Party of Russia, which is still around today, I might add. And it's not a CIA cutout either. And Yeltsin won. And indeed, the Americans were so happy that they had an article in the Time magazine in the aftermath saying, yay, we won. But when they meant we won, they're not referring to Yeltsin, they're referring to the United States. We won. So there you go. But of course, as we all know, Yeltsin, he enjoyed vodka more than he enjoyed running his own country. So eventually, he went to the wayside and he got replaced by Putin. Now, Putin isn't controlled by the United States. And of course, the United States basically thought they could undermine him initially, by having a bunch of Western educated technocrats inside the Russian government. But that didn't work because anyone who's paying attention knows that when old Vlad was on his second term, yeah, he basically had all these people removed. Indeed, I remember one of them, whose name I can't recall. He was basically in charge of the Russian defense minister, and he wanted to basically disassemble the defense ministry. Yeah, he wanted to get rid of the various equivalents of West Point and other military academies. And Putin basically said, no way. And so he got rid of the guy and replaced him with the guy who's there now, Shoigu, who doesn't work for the CIA or American intelligence. But according to WikiLeaks, this Navalny, he somehow appeared he first appeared during Putin's second term. And indeed, he was part of a political organization simply known as DA, which is basically Russian for yes. Did it get anywhere? Not really. In fact, despite the Western propaganda, let's just say this: he was more popular outside of Russia than he was inside of Russia. So there you go. And besides Medvedev, Putin's number one homie, he ended up becoming president instead. But of course, as we all know, Medvedev was basically a sock puppet for Putin. And thus, when Medvedev served that one term, Putin came back in 2012. What was it, 2014? Yeah, 2012, I think it was 2012. And Putin's been there ever since. So there you go. But it didn't mean that this Navalny guy went away. Oh yeah, he stayed there and basically like a damn burr under the saddle of the Russian government. And the funny thing is, this Navalny guy, despite the Western propaganda, he was no George Washington, okay? Indeed, when Navalny thought no one was looking, he tended to hang out with neo-Nazi types. No joke. But you never would know that if you listen to Western news media. But according to old Brian Beletic, he has the receipts. In fact, I will post a link to his video, and that way you can watch the whole video, because he's got the receipts like gangbusters, all right? Okay. But eventually, I guess Navalny made too much noise. And that's when he started getting arrested by the Russian government on a variety of charges. Were the charges legit? Hard to say. Funny thing about Russian justice is that it can be unjust. Oh yeah. Just ask all those oligarchs who got super wealthy under Yeltsin how they feel about Russian justice. Yeah, a lot of them got run through the ripsaw because they failed to pay their back taxes, according to the Russian government. And most of them lost their fortunes, and a couple of them lost their lives. And most of those people got run out of town and run out of Russia too, without their fortunes, I might add. Even though there are a few actually managed to leave Russia before the tax man showed up and ended up in places like the United States and England and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to get into that. But of course, as we all know, Navalny, he claimed that he was poisoned on an airplane. It was all over the Western media. And indeed, he didn't die, but he eventually ended up in Germany. But the Germans, they looked at the guy and while the news media was going on and on about, oh, he got poisoned by Putin, etc., and on forth, they couldn't really find any hard evidence that he was poisoned, especially not by something like for real, like some kind of nerve agent. And indeed, a lot of the damn Western media claimed that he was being poisoned by Novichok. And of course, if you're familiar with poisons, it's a old Soviet era, nerve agent. Very nasty stuff. So nasty that the Soviets didn't even put it into full production. True story. In fact, funny thing about Novichok is even though it's an old Soviet era chemical, the only people who seem to have it on stockpile seem to be in Western countries. No joke. You can look it up. Craziest thing I've ever read. Well, anyway, Navalny, after he came back from Germany, he got arrested again. Got charged with, got all kinds of new charges. Were they legit? Don't know. But this time he wasn't going for any sightseeing outside of Russia. Nope. One place he was going to some prison camp way up in the Arctic Circle. And that's where he was when he dropped dead. Now, of course, right now the news media in the West is screaming, oh, the black guy was murdered. Oh, Putin spitting the guy's food or whatever. Did Putin poison the guy? Don't know. Only the Russians are saying is that the guy fell ill in prison and died. And the initial report coming out of Russia, I might add, said that he died of a blood clot. Does this happen in real life? Yeah. People known to die of blood clots. Ever heard of deep vein thrombosis? Yeah. So it tends to happen. Problem is, that only happens if you're on a long distance airplane flight. And since Navalny was sitting in the damn gulag, well, there you go. So what happens now? Well, I guess Navalny's next of kin are going to have to go to a funeral, I suppose. And indeed, Navalny's wife, who strangely enough was in Munich as part of some international security conference, which is when her husband died, claimed that she was going to continue her husband's work. And I'm thinking, oh, really? As a CIA cutout? I mean, it's so strange that the man would die when his wife is at this big whoop-de-doo with all these Western leaders. In fact, you almost could say it's suspicious. So there you go. But when you look at the history of Navalny, you can't help but be suspicious. Because a long time ago, Mark Twain once said, you can't have a republic at home and an empire abroad. What does that mean? I think he was talking about the old Roman Empire. Because anyone who remembers how Rome had a republic, but then they started trying to build their own empire, the wars against Carthage and later Gaul. And then what happened? Old Julius showed up in Rome and declared himself dictator of Rome. And of course, as history books tell us, that didn't last too long. When old Brutus, stuck a knife in the guy's back, both figuratively and literally. And yet, despite that homicide, Rome eventually did lose its republic and it became an empire. So there you go. But I think when old Mark Twain said that, I think he was talking about the United States. Because when he said that, it was basically in the early 20th century. And I guess he probably saw how in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the United States was beginning to look less like the United States and more like the British Empire. And I suppose he didn't like it. And indeed, if you recall, the Spanish-American War, the United States did inherited a few pieces of real estate, like the Philippines and Cuba and whatnot. And I'm pretty certain old Mark Twain probably felt that if we were going to start being mean and nasty to the people in those countries to rule over them, then those tactics eventually return home to rule over us. And therefore, when you look at what the United States has been doing in places like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like Russia, and wait for it, Ukraine. Yeah. Remember all those color revolutions? Like was it the Orange Revolution in Ukraine? Yeah. And of course the coup that happened in 2014. Uh-huh. And wait for it, the so-called Rose Rebellion that occurred in Georgia. And I don't mean Georgia as in Atlanta, Georgia. No, I'm talking about the old Soviet Georgia. Yeah. All those deals were basically cooked up by the United States. What for? Apparently to build their own empire. And you say, really? Why? Why not? Well, Navalny's dead, and I guess the American CIA is going to have to find another new cutout to take on the dreaded Vlad, huh? Will it be Navalny's wife? Maybe. Maybe not. Because the funny thing about the CIA is that it's sort of like God. It works in mysterious ways. Well, that's all I have to say about Navalny. And, yeah, that's all I got to say about him. That's my opinion.